Hello and welcome to this webinar on lessons from Palestine Solidarity Encampment movement in the US, where we discuss and try to gain an insight to the pro-Palestine encampments in the US universities that have actively called for an end to genocide in Palestine, alongside a call for their respective universities to boycott and divest investments and grants made and received by the universities across US from Israel. The pro-Palestine solidarity encampments have left a mark in the face of the brutal genocide warfare that Israel has unleashed on the state of Palestine. The encampment movement across various universities in the US have been a testimony to the fact that we are all in this together, calling for the liberation of Palestine from the illegal and dehumanizing occupation by Israel. The objective tonight is to get an insight to what is going on in these encampments in solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian liberation. It is therefore of immense significance, as we see, that we learn from our friends and comrades in these encampments to stand in protest and in solidarity and carry out the struggle forward of Palestinian liberation. So before we proceed, let me briefly talk about how we are going to go ahead with the webinar. So there shall be a number of direct questions, and we shall hear from each of our speakers on these questions. The questions shall be directed to every speaker, and I would request them to take their turns with a question. We shall also invite questions from the audience towards the end, and that is actually provisional to if we have time by the end of the webinar. So the first question is if you could please tell us about the economic ties that your respective universities have with Israel and how they are complicit in the ongoing genocide of the Palestinian people.
Sure. So our encampment was recently shut down. We were going for about 17 days. Our major demands were about financial disclosure and then divestment. Because like a lot of universities in the United States, DePaul isn't clear with where our tuition money goes and what kind of companies contribute to the university's endowment fund. So the first thing that students are fighting for is financial disclosure, because the degree to which these different companies are contributing to this endowment fund is kind of unclear. However, we do know that DePaul has accepted tens of thousands of dollars in donations from weapons manufacturers like Raytheon in the past. Our School of Computer Science has collaborated with them on several projects. Our school newspaper posted in 2018 that DePaul guarantees jobs at Raytheon after graduation. But they don't really post if any percentage of our tuition goes to like funding these partnerships or contracts with companies, particularly like cybersecurity companies contributing to surveillance here and abroad, whether that be like in over-policed neighborhoods in America or, in Palestine, or with weapons manufacturers like Raytheon or Boeing. So we therefore don't really know like what companies contribute to the endowment fund and whose interests are being catered to within our institution, which kind of represents a bigger problem in America of not really understanding who our university works for. But there are DePaul also sponsors study abroad programs that are de facto discriminatory against Palestinians, and then legitimize the illegal occupation of Palestine by Israel. I know that we offer art and architecture programs to Israel, interfaith trips to Israel that are not offered to Jewish students unless they've already been on birthright. And I'm not sure if our comrades internationally are familiar with birthright, but it's a program sponsored by very large Zionist organizations that allow Jewish Americans, I'm not sure if it's open to Jewish people internationally, but to visit Israel for like a 2-week period. And during that process, it's a lot of propagandizing, a lot of legitimization of the illegal occupation and really military force used upon Palestinians. And then I think lastly, DePaul has a really long history of retaliating against students and faculty that speak up against Palestinian oppression. Um, Very famously, Normal Finkelstein, the descendant of two Holocaust survivors and a professor of political science, was denied tenure from DePaul in 2006 because of his anti-Zionist politics. And then now, very recently, somebody in my department or in health sciences was just fired for offering an optional assignment regarding Palestine. Um, and a lot of us are fighting back against that. As a Jewish student organizer, I can also speak to like the inherent biases present in our mission and ministry regarding like what's considered political, um, the Israel advocacy groups that are unrecognized by the university have preferential treatment over recognized Jewish student organizations that have like anti-Zionist politics. Um, and I think that there's just a whole lot there that needs to be changed.
To jump in on that, I feel like our situations are actually very similar, which is interesting. So first of all, I'm also Jewish and anti-Zionist, and I can corroborate that about Birthright. It is, and adding on, it is essentially a propaganda trip. You get all these, I haven't been on it, thank God, but from hearing about it, it's one of those trips where you're carefully kept away from the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, and you're showed all of these sexy IDF soldiers, and it's very scummy. And that's insane that these students are only allowed to go if they've already been on Birthright. But we also, I go to Mass College of Art and Design, and we're a little bit of a unique school in that we are one of the only publicly funded art schools in the country. So we are a public school, which means we have a lot of it's a commuter school. We have a lot of students, who are on financial aid. We have a lot of students who, maybe can't afford to live on campus and commute from elsewhere in the area. But it's also an art school, so we have a very specific type of person who comes to the school, and it's also very small. We didn't have any organized pro-Palestine organization before essentially October 7th of last year, when a lot of us came together in the wake of one of our students held a walkout. And then there was sort of like this, processing area that, sprung up with some of the, sympathetic professors, and those of us who had organized or been involved in the walkout sort of coagulated and talked, and we formed Mass Artists for Palestine. So we're a very new org. And our focuses have been, because we have a public school, our school is required by law to disclose who our funders are. But they don't, because because of the nature of bureaucracy, it takes a really long time to get them to disclose, and the administration basically relies on that to keep people from knowing who funds our school. So we have found out, doing a little legwork so far, that one of the donors has ties to Israel, and as we do some mapping, I am expecting to see lots of trustees and alumni donations that have those ties. So disclosure is, again, what we're focusing on now. But we also have an art exchange program with Bezalel University in Tel Aviv. And we have this program, and the disparity in who has come here from Israel and who has been sent to Israel is enormous. We haven't sent a student there in years, because who from an art school in Massachusetts, USA, would want to go to Israel to study? But we have had so many students from Tel Aviv come here. A lot of them are fashion design students, and we have allegedly, we haven't had anyone willing to come forward non-anonymously, but they are horrendous to the Palestinian and Arab students in their departments. They will openly harass them. And a lot of them are in fashion design, and they have had an event on their campus unofficially where some of the fashion design students made uniforms for the IDF. So they are heavily in bed with the IDF in that school. So we are focusing on, that's the most public tie that we have to Israel so far. That's what we're focusing on there. And that's disclosure is what we're focusing on in terms of strategy too, as in line with the demands of other student encampments across the country.
Ocean State Student Worker Alliance was we're a community organization that was helping out at the protests. We were helping out at the Brown and the RISD protests, and within regards to specifically Rhode Island School of Design, the main focus was on the school's ties to the company Airbnb, which for those who are not like aware, it's like you can it's a website that allows you to facilitate using your apartment as a hotel room for like tourists who come into who come to your city or whatever. So there's like the founder was who graduated from Rhode Island School of Design, so there's a lot of ties between the board and Airbnb. You know, and as well as the company Textron, that was it's a defense company, that sort of militarily, the amount of military aid that goes to the Zionist occupation. Textron is one of these companies that's actively helping that, through their programs. So they're also on the board. And there's it's not so much of an investment, but they are sort of entwined. And so many of the Rhode Island School of Design students were less. They were trying to stop that sort of relationship.
So I think you can see from what Maria is saying about Airbnb, a lot of these companies are agents of class war here. So Airbnb specifically is so people will buy up properties specifically to rent out as Airbnbs, and it will drive rents up in cities and urban areas, and people won't be able to rent actual apartments. So you can see how these Israeli companies will further class war in the United States. So it's important to fight that war, that double, that sort of killing two birds with one stone there.
The main tie that first comes to mind between my university and Israel is their programs and grants connected to IBM, and it's known that they're a major developer of surveillance technology used on Palestinians throughout the occupied territories. And this technology also it's certainly tied to the AI systems like Lavender, which, if I remember correctly, goes on to be used to directly target artillery on Palestinian men and their families. And this sort of tie, because our university is partnered with IBM for some sort of sustainability accelerator, and that's full of that liberal hypocrisy and opportunism, because it's this university will always tout its dedication to making progress towards climate justice, but all of that is undone in a blink of an eye when chemical weapons and 1,000-pound bombs are dropped on Palestinians, which aren't exactly the best to be using on the environment. And not only that, but the occupation itself is full of greenwashing. The trees that Israel brags about planting all the time are not only invasive European pines that catch fire in the Levantine sun, but they're specifically often planted in areas to cover up destroyed Palestinian villages. So that's I feel that sort of connection is something that we really have to stress in our demands for divestment.
I think that the pattern that has been established by my comrades across the country is very much at play in Richmond at Virginia Commonwealth University. So I think that the big thing to note here is that there's a lot we don't know because of the complete obscurity that the investments and endowment of VCU sort of operate under. There are multiple sort of shell corporation type things that actually hold the assets for the university. So it's very difficult for us to clarify the exact connections between the Zionist entity and VCU. That being said, there are a couple things that we do know very clearly. The first one being that we have an exchange program with the Hebrew University, I do believe, in so-called Israel. Specifically, this centers around an archaeological project that is operated, I think, in Jerusalem, I want to say. But it's an archaeological dig site where they get students from VCU to literally do colonialist work in Palestine, right? Like, it's not just that the students are legitimizing so-called Israel by participating in their educational institutions, but they're being, deputized to participate in actual acts of colonialism, actual acts of expropriation from the Palestinian people. And this is just, the most visible connection that VCU has to the Zionists. But Richmond has deep connections to Israel, so called, and that really comes out in the Virginia Israel. Excuse me, what is it? The Virginia Israel Investment Advisory Board, which is a state body that is funded by taxpayers that is dedicated to coordinating Israeli investment into the state of Virginia. Virginia is the home of numerous weapons manufacturers. I don't know if you've ever been to Northern Virginia, but it's one of the most evil places in the entire world, where you see the Raytheon headquarters, where you see General Dynamics headquarters, and these buildings look evil. It's not just like they're, you know, uh, big building. They're just like they're sharp. They're made of glass. They're black buildings. It's a terrifying thing. So yeah, Virginia really is, at the heart of the weapons industry in the United States, and that is a deep connection to Virginia Commonwealth University.
I'm Lizzie. I'm a student organizer from Emory University. Yeah, so Emory is objectively the most Zionist university in the entire American South. Um, our president visits Israel periodically. The theological school, which I'm a student of, has programs involving Israel. They have so they have sort of Hebrew Bible like archaeological expeditions, as others have mentioned. Then they also have a you can go on a pilgrimage for peace, which takes you to the West Bank, but only the Israeli side of it, to see about like how sad it is that the apartheid is happening and all these other things. Which of course they don't encourage you to do anything about that, but you can do it. We also have lots of very, I don't know how to say this. I don't want to say high ranking necessarily, but very high status Zionists from broader American society are, major donors to the university. If some legislation is put forward by the student government or something like that, to do a boycott, divestment, and sanctions, for example, which happened recently, uh, donors will contact the school and say, block the bill, or I'm pulling my $100 million out of the school. And this is not even to enter, like, we have students here whose tuition is paid by the IDF. We have IDF veterans who are paid to be here to spread their sort of insane rhetoric, because on top of being one of the most Zionist universities in the South, uh, because they know who their target audience is, we also have the largest population of Jewish students by percentage. So these IDF soldiers are sent and they're paid by the IDF to be at Emory University. So, Emory's getting money from the IDF that way, and 100 other ways as well. Our computing program is one of the companies it feeds into is Elbit. Our very prestigious business school feeds into McKinsey, which funds different things. It's just every school, no matter where you go, is invested at this university into Israel in very open ways. Yeah, it's insane. It would take longer to say which donors aren't Israeli or Zionists than which ones are.
I'm from the University of Rochester, and I know our board of trustees. I think 17 of them are, represent companies that are invested in Israel, and the head of the chair of the board of trustees, his name is, I kid you not, Rich Handler, and he is a rabid Zionist. He was able to interview Herzog, which is a very high level Israeli official. He's a finance capitalist. But besides that, most research universities, we have I think we get 300 million from the U.S. government, and I think around 10% of that comes from the Department of Defense, and even the non-Department of Defense money, a lot of it goes to funding research that is useful for military purposes. And like other people talked about, the main thing our SJP was focusing on was the academic ties, because the financial ties, I think a few years ago they had an ethical investment plan, and they dropped a lot of military investments and whatnot. So I'm not sure how much of it, there may still be companies that are not military that are invested in the occupation, but I think that's a lot less than maybe other schools. But we do have a lot of exchange programs. I think we have some relationships with the Chaim Weizmann Institute, Technion, and so forth. I know there's one professor, I think, in electrical engineering. He has a dual appointment between us and I think Technion. So I think that's the main thing that our relationship is with Israel. And but yeah.
So could you tell us about what lessons did you learn from, or if there were any lessons you learned from movements that took over America in the 60s, like anti-war movements, Vietnam War protests, the May 68 protests, etc. What are some things you could have done differently? We just want a reflection on it.
So, kind of interestingly, our encampment started very rapidly without a lot of preparation. I think it was planned over a weekend, which is surprising given how long it lasted. So I don't think that there was really a lot of consideration for a historical basis for how to succeed here. But I think the most important lesson that we talked about while in our encampment from the Vietnam War protest era from the late 1960s was to talk about how to avoid this event being something that you just talk about as an adult, just something cool you did as a teenager or as a young adult, rather than being steadfast in your dedication to an anti-colonial movement. Kind of avoid turning to conservatism or contentment with the way things are after you failed once. Because I'll probably mention this later, this is one battle in a larger war. We need to keep our momentum, and that's something that I think we're actively struggling with at the moment because of what direction we're supposed to take now as kind of disorganized groups of people now without an encampment. But I think that just the trajectory of our movement, even though we've lost our encampment, we're really struggling to keep this momentum alive, especially right now in light of one of our professors being fired for offering that optional assignment on Palestine. There's a lot of momentum happening with our labor movement. I'll probably mention it later in reference to some other questions, but DePaul University is the only university in Chicago that is ununionized, and our union campaign became public really at the same time that the encampment started. So our union has been working very closely with the coalition, of students that made up the encampment. Luckily, the people who run the union are like mostly communists or socialists, so they're extremely sympathetic and active in the divestment movement. But really, just to make my point shorter, it's about learning how to prevent becoming kind of apolitical, content with the system types of adults. And that's kind of the lesson we're trying to learn here.
Yeah, no. Again, with Owen, I think that the situation is very similar in Boston as in Chicago. So a lot of the encampments that I've been involved in, so Mass Art didn't encamp, but we were sending, because we're a small school, and we were sending people to the encampments around. We had an encampment at Northeastern University, at MIT, at Harvard, at Emerson, which you all probably heard about, and at Tufts. And with those, all of those, I was involved in organizing those to various extents. All of them were fairly disorganized. All of them sprung up very spontaneously, and none of them allotted time for serious political education. There were little free libraries that had zines and books to maybe read. A lot of people did not read them. Most people were sort of sitting. There have been sort of like info sessions, very high level, nothing that involves people like committing to regular study. So I don't think that we have studied enough or learned enough from the 68 movement. And I've done a little on my own. Like we had a little workshop at Mass Art to talk about, like I'm a printmaking major, and me and some people from our screen printing club did a little workshop. We talked about printmaking in the 1968 movement with the Black Panthers, with the École des Beaux-Arts in France. And so that was fun. But again, it's sort of one-off. And I don't think we have allotted enough time to political study. And it's really important that we study this particular era. So I'm glad that you I'm really glad that you asked this question, because we live in the age of recuperation, at least here in America, in the wake and directly in response to 68 and the student protests. We have seen like intense effort towards recuperation on the part of the state and the bourgeois to direct revolutionary energy among young people and among like different interest groups fighting for liberation into nonprofit organizations and the state. So we are living in an age in which like Gen Z, like our generation grew up being told, work within the system, vote blue no matter who, go get a job at a nonprofit, you can get a job canvassing. All of these things can be done without posing a real problem to the ruling class. So I think people are starting to get conscious of that because we have seen the failure of that in recent years, with the Biden administration being unwilling to offer any concessions because they know that people won't pose a threat. And with all of these nonprofits like Human Rights Campaign, which is this mainstream gay and lesbian organization, very transphobic also, sort of capitulating to Zionism. And so I think that this is a really important jumping off point and a really great way to move forward with our encampments, to maintain that momentum and to get more disciplined and more militant. I personally plan to push for that. And also just adding on to things that we can learn and things that were different from 68. I actually went to Northwestern in Chicago near Owen before I transferred. I took a year or so off and then transferred to Mass Art. So I have experience in both cities vaguely. And Dr. Stephen Thrasher, who works at Northwestern and who I had the opportunity to go to a lecture by, he teaches journalism there, and he's a radical. And he has brought this up, and many people who have studied that period have brought up, these encampments have been far less confrontational than anything that went on in 68. People will talk about militants, but at the end of the day, again, we live in the age of recuperation, and just my generation of student activists are not prepared to take on this level of escalation. And I think that that's, again, something that I've seen a lot of interest in moving forward with learning how to do. So I have a lot of optimism about moving forward, but we are very much at a beginning stage.
Yeah, so Art and Owen are really hit the ball out of the park here, because like it's a very interesting question. I do sort of really agree with what they're saying. As a community organization, as a mass organization that sort of existed in Providence, Rhode Island, for several years, predating what went down in at the universities, Ocean State Student Worker Alliance, we were trying to, we sort of saw what was going on, and we sort of like we were looking at previous sort of huge waves of student protests, specifically like with encampments and that kind of stuff, and we were like, we could like the way that we were sort of coming at it was, we need to find a way to bridge the gap between the working community, right, the people who live in the cities that these universities are at, and the students themselves, right. And that's sort of what we thought might like make this a little different. So fundamentally, we were trying to work with the different student groups. We were working with some of our mass contacts who were interested, and our other community organizers who had shown up to support the protests and the encampments. That's sort of the strategy that we went at when we went at it. I think with what Owen was, and this will go into a later question, but what Owen was saying about the sort of like, the 1960s being this thing that your parents or your grandparents talk about as this like really cool thing that happened, right? But then fundamentally what happened afterwards, it was just sort of a period of there was a period of stagnation and then a period of like some of the most reactionary politics that America has, not some of the most, because America's always been a very reactionary country. But the like 20 years after the 1960s, right, was immediately the what's called by your neoliberal political science professors as the Reagan Revolution, right, in which neoliberal politics and some of the most reactionary politics we've seen in recent years sort of economically popped up. So that's sort of something that we are really focused on, is like the trying to get the advanced student organizers, those who are the most agitated, the most angry, the most advanced ideologically, and try to get them for them to keep up the momentum, because like once the sort of flash in the pan dies down, the way at least I see it, you gotta find those with the most potential, and you're gonna just have to accept that some people are just gonna go back to what they were doing. Unfortunately, they may be able to be won back later, but immediately after, it's supposed to be. We sort of understood it as something that was not gonna last forever, and to try and get some sort of material gains out of that might be good in the long term. And if that makes sense. And that's sort of all I wanted to say about that.
All right, so I guess it's my turn now. So, I mean, I wasn't the main organizer of the encampment, but I did my best to stick with my comrades all the way through. Like, we were out here waking up at like 3, 4 a.m. so we could get to the area early enough to set up. But like, going back to like what one of our other comrades said about like momentum, militancy, and like political education, a really large concern in Stony Brook in content for SGP now is keeping up not just like the momentum, but also our like overall organization as a whole, since so many of our main committee members have either graduated or been like suspended and banned off campus. And like, I'm not part of that main committee, but I've been like very consistently active and part of e-boards for like other main collaborating organizations. So I feel like that's sort of like working with other student organizations on campus to like keep direction and like sort of structure with our movement will be really important, just to like stay like alive in terms of like organization. And we also like can't let the movement like die down to a point where people are like willing to like settle for like half concessions, and like, you know, they let like divestment like bills like die in committee, or like they drag out like these like policy makings or like discussions to like where they just don't happen at all, and like the movement fizzles out and dies out. We can't let that happen. So I feel like it's it's like a really big concern for us, like when like the original main committee that started like when momentum was like at its peak, like from October, like we have to keep that. And then again, I'm not part of the main committee, so I'm not exactly sure like what the tactic for that is, like what the overall plan is for that, since we're still like the board is still going over that. But yeah, like we I don't know how to word it exactly, but yeah, we can't, you know, let admin like fizzle it out, because like our encampment lasted only like 2 days before we were shut down, and like both faculty and students were arrested here at Stony Brook. So yeah.
Yeah, so when it comes to 68, we had passed out at our encampment, and I was involved directly in the planning of the encampment from day zero. We had a field guide, which was a sort of manifesto and community guidelines passed out, which was directly informed by Colombia's 1968 occupation. We were in contact with Colombia's contemporary occupation leadership the entire time leading up to our encampment, which lasted like 4 hours before we were brutalized. As far as lessons of 68 that I feel like were carried forward, honestly, the movement was executed in a somewhat isolated way. And the reason for that is because, and this is, you know, this is a strange parallel to draw, but I'm reminded of the Great Patriotic War, right? The most ideologically committed and advanced sectors of the student leadership were the first ones to the front line when the police showed up. And so what ended up happening was some of our most dedicated core, some of our most experienced organizers, they came to the front line when the police showed up. They got arrested. They got banned from campus. They got physically, mentally, etc., brutalized by these police officers. If you've been following the Stop Cop City struggle in Atlanta, the same people that killed our comrade Tortuguita were there. So, like the same departments. So there was a lot of, I guess, scattering because people were not super organized. There was a very big concern on in the planning sessions for the encampment. There's this thing that kept happening where people would go, okay, what's our plan for such and such engagement with the police? Like, if the police show up and do this, what's our plan? And there was a very dominant force of a small clique of activists whose response to everything was, well, we can't plan for everything. And so a lot of the planning that maybe could have gotten done wasn't. And this was cloaked in the militancy of 68, without being like a very material engagement with it. I will say that we definitely had students who felt this continuity and there was like a screening on the quad after the camp was broken up. There was a screening on the shared green space here of like a movie about the 68 occupations, and it sort of increased the feeling of militancy. But as far as the material lessons people took from 68, seemingly nothing. Like nominally, obviously, whatever, throwaway phrases about honoring ancestors and things like that, and then never actually listening to what any of those people did, but instead taking a very adventurous, very um, individualistic form of organization. So, um, yeah, I'll let that stand there. I appreciate it. Thank you.
So the first thing that I'd like to do is just share some points from a comrade that I think are vital to consider in light of this question. So something important to hit on in this is the fact that any movement in the so-called United States will probably fail. And so mastering the dialectics of a strategic offensive and the strategic defensive is vital. We need to be capable of hitting hard for 5 or 6 years, recognizing when we get outmaneuvered, because eventually we will get outmaneuvered, and then go back onto the defensive. Another smaller point the comrade wanted to emphasize is the technical and mechanical skills that people had in the 68 versus today. People had better understanding of like carpentry, of woodworking. There was a better understanding of how to actually construct defensive materials for these various encampments. Also, we have to remember that the ruling class itself reacted to 68, right? And in fact, the ruling class itself is reacting to this latest manifestation of the encampment movement by changing the campuses, by redesigning the buildings to make them unoccupiable. And a lot of this was actually like there's some interesting stuff about like weird architecture and like modern architecture being implemented in some schools that sort of lead to confusing layouts with dead ends and stuff to make them more difficult to occupy by students, by activists. So the next thing I wanted to read out was a summation of the VCU encampment that one of the core organizers supplied to be read for this. It's pretty brief, but it goes over who we are, what we did, the victories, and the mistakes. So I think this is relevant. We had a coalition of elected representatives from a number of local groups on and off campus to form a steering committee. For example, there were reps from SJP, AMP, PSL, VCU Red, the Students Union at VCU, and more. The steering committee was a total of 17 people that were subdivided into 2 groups, decision makers and support. Everyone attended every meeting and voted, but if there was a split vote, then only the decision makers would vote. However, this led to heavy, long discussions where we would become redundant and drag out simple discussions. I think a smaller set of folks would have been more efficient. Some represented orgs had 2 or 3 reps. It should have been limited to 1 per org to avoid having too many cooks in the kitchen. Each representative was assigned various tasks in different realms. For example, there was a medical head who was in charge of finding medical staff, of creating a medical supplies list and creating the needed medical supplies. There was a divestment team who had a primary focus of creating the demands and would also negotiate said demands with staff. The demands were the standard 4D demands that we've seen across campuses: disclose all institutional expenditure, divest from all companies and partnerships that support or profit from the so-called Israelis' occupation and colonization of Palestine and her people, defend pro-Palestinian speech and activism on campus, and declare support for a permanent and immediate ceasefire, along with immediate end to the occupation, colonization, and ethnic cleansing of Palestinians in Palestine, while condemning the United States' role in the ongoing genocide. There were also various other roles like camp management, social media, education, disruption, safety, legal, and university relations between the SJPs across the state. What we did. We had about 5 days of meeting and planning that led us to the decision to begin with a legal liberated zone on the VCU lawn outside of the library and the campus, an epicenter of the campus that sees hundreds, if not thousands, of students passing from class to class. The zone had no structures yet. Structures as in like tents, as in like buildings, as in like permanent fixtures. Um, no structures yet, as it was against policy and a clear escalation, and instead had a free food and water station and a medical station, along with art activities like sign making. There was also chanting, dancing, students studying, all this stuff. Generally occupying the space in a non-escalatory way. Once the crowd grew to a size that felt comfortable, we moved towards escalation in the form of a camp. Students and community members that weren't studying circled the camp as a human barrier, while those who stayed pitched their tents. Once the camp was established, we transitioned into a rally, and afterwards, students went back to their various activities, like dabka, studying, or just socializing with the new established community. If I remember correctly, the camp was established around 5:30, and riot police began to arrive around 7 p.m. That's 5:30 p.m. to 7 p.m. While we were waiting for the police forces to arrive, we received a tip about an hour before their arrival. We trained the crowd on de-arrest and how to use reinforced barriers. Reinforced banners are a must if you're expecting a police encounter when it comes to the continuance of your camp's existence. A steering member also led the de-arrest lesson/demo and taught taught the crowd how to tie t-shirt masks, what to do if you see someone being arrested, the use of projectiles, personal security, and more. This information is likely too sensitive for this medium, but there are resources out there on these valuable skills that are truly imperative to be privy to before an action that might be met with state repression in the form of arrests. The crowd did an excellent job executing these skills, even though we ultimately had to decide to disperse. The final call to disperse by organizers remained around 10 or 10:30. However, these timestamps may be somewhat off, as at the end of the night was obviously chaotic and traumatic, and I'm attempting to recall these timestamps from memory alone. For more precise timestamps, Goat Gatsby on Twitter is an excellent source. I'll repost that Twitter link in the chat. Also, before the launch day, a local org held a Know Your Rights training. This is highly recommended, along with connecting with any local bail funds beforehand. I just want to underline this point. This is extremely important lesson from all this, that there's an activist infrastructure in most cities, and there is not enough done to connect the students, the revolutionaries, the workers, and activists in general in the cities. We need to be making robust infrastructures for ourselves for when state repression comes. Let's talk about the victories. While our demands were not met and the camp was violently shut down the day of its launch, there were certainly numerous victories and milestones achieved. For example, a young Palestinian woman was specifically targeted by the riot police, and they made attempts to grab her and arrest her at least 3 times. However, the crowd around her successfully de-arrested her each time. She was also not the only one to be de-arrested. If we hadn't done a de-arrest training prior, it is my belief that there would have been more arrests than the 13 we saw that night. Virginia Tech days before saw over 80 arrests. There were also high numbers at Mary Washington. And despite the fight we put up that led to the riot police retreating 3 times to regroup, our school had some of the lowest arrest numbers in the state. Across Virginia universities, VCU was the only one to actually attempt to fight back. This includes any VA schools that participated in the GW camp that were technically within DC. This was also momentous for Richmond as a city, because even during the BLM revival of 2020, we didn't see head-to-head combat with RPD like we saw on the 29th. During the 2020 protests, RPD took a more distanced approach, utilizing long-distance tools like tear gas, then plucking folks who ran or were disoriented for arrest. We didn't see them with state police head-to-head with protesters as the crowds threw projectiles or threw shin kicks below reinforced barriers. But we saw all these advancements on the 29th. Additionally, anyone who was there that night learned valuable skills that were also put into practice that can be taken into future actions. Therefore, raising the collective consciousness around self-defense against the state for many of the most radicalized and active community members, students who are willing to escalate and take critical risks. Along with that, another key victory was the establishment of an interconnected network of different organizations. Even if the steering committee falls apart, the individuals still carry those connections and should continue to foster this unity. Further, it's not only the steering committee that made these connections, but also the many participants who showed up and spent the day creating new relationships with a wider network. Mistakes, what we learned. In my opinion, our key failures were lack of defensive supplies and lack of contingency plans. We hadn't anticipated 3 separate police departments being sent out on the first night with immediate escalation at such a high level of intensity. Because we did not expect this, we didn't have the full extent of our defensive supplies on the site that first day, and this proved fatal to the longevity of the camp. Some aspects of defensive supplies we were lacking were follows: a strong, secure perimeter or barrier, eye protection to protect from chemicals like pepper spray and mace, umbrellas also to protect from chemical sprays, but also great for protection from rubber bullets and overhead surveillance, as well as useful knocking off riot helmets. Paint, spray paint for riot helmet shields. Police and riot gear had to fall back when they lose visibility. Spray paint or paint in water balloons as projectiles work well against riot shields and riot visors. Heat resistance gloves to lob tear gas canisters back to the police line. Laser pointers to disorient the police. Hard hats for head protection. Some were beat with riot shields. It's important to protect the skull. Yeah, I can verify that some people were hit in the head. Along this line, it would have been helpful to debrief the crowd on the effects of pepper spray or mace, like teaching them how to rinse water and not to panic, further making it known that it might feel like you can't breathe, but this is just a misleading physical sensation, and to instruct them to breathe as normal without panicking, even if it feels strange. With this type of debrief, along with handing out full water bottles for rinsing, I think less people would have fled when the police began their assault. We had also planned a trash can shield workshop for the next day. This would have been useful to organize sooner so that they could have been ready the first night. In regard to lack of contingency plans, had we done this before then, we might have had a clearer plan of action when the police began their assault and started destroying the liberated zone. For example, maybe we could have planned to escalate by moving into a nearby building and occupying that space instead. Maybe we could have had a second set of supplies on standby off-site. So once the camp was destroyed, it could be rebuilt and reestablished once the police left the zone thinking their work was complete. Do not underestimate the police. Over prepare, even if it means postponing the action by another day or two. There are certainly many other aspects that could be addressed or analyzed, but it's my belief that these are the key victories and the key failures, along with the key lessons learned to be shared and taken into future actions.
I wasn't personally at the University of Rochester. I wasn't involved with the like main SJP. I'm a grad worker in organizing. We're trying to form a union right now. That's the main thing I'm working on. But so I can't really speak to how much they took from May '68 and that round of student uprisings. But I have to say, from just like guessing, I feel like it probably was not much, and I do think that like the spontaneous movement surged far ahead of anything that like conscious like student organizers could have planned. But I can speak about 2 main lessons, I think. One, I feel like, is a way to communicate with students that's beyond, or just like the campus community in general, that's beyond like social media. Because one of the things that I found was that, because like whenever the university whenever they went to occupy a building, the university sent out like mass emails, and it was always done in a way that like painted them as the students as like crazy people and like as aggressors. And I feel like that was an important like moment for the university, because like they were able to spin the narrative the way they want to and like build support for like cracking down on it, which they eventually did. But so I do think that like besides like social media, whether it's like emails or like texting people, or just like there needs to be something beyond just like posting, hey, everyone meet up here at this time on social media, because that relies purely on like spontaneity. Besides that, I do think the other main weakness at the University of Rochester was the isolation of the students. It was mainly the undergrads who were the most organized. There's like 1,500 like janitor, like and healthcare workers at the U of R, and they were clearly like not involved. I mean, there were like there was a ton of community support for sure, but this was very like localized on an individual level, or just like within the activist organizations, not in mass orgs like a union, for example. And also like even like among grad workers, and this is I guess self-criticism as well, is that currently we don't have a union and we're trying to organize a union, but because of that, where it is hard for us currently to actually be more public and aggressive, because like people aren't even like organized now. So this is a long process for us that we were trying to do. But yeah.
So I think just generally on the experience, I understand that like the encampment movement wasn't built for the development of student organizers, and that we were here for, material goals related to divestment and the end of our university's complicity in the occupation of Palestine. But I do think that there was strong progress made in young student organizers becoming efficient organizers. In a lot of cases, this was people's first mobilization experience outside of like what's usually police sanctioned walkouts or protests. And I think we did like a fairly good job at becoming better organizers and learning how to mobilize in a way outside of these police sanctioned actions. I think that despite our failure to divest, again, this is just like one battle in that war for divestment. I think that the encampment brought our community together and taught young people how to organize, what to do better for next time, and how to potentially escalate. A lot of students were radicalized. I think that through our committees, which are essentially just, for those unfamiliar, just groups of people organizing for a specific goal within the encampment. So we had committees for news or revolutionary study or art or food. And I think that our revolutionary study committee did a really great job getting people to interact with texts or ideas that they wouldn't have already considered. I think that like one really important thing to consider here is that I think we started talking a little bit about this, of like working within the system being kind of fed to students. There's like a large faction of organizers who are members of like the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, particularly in a program called Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies, or PACS. And I think it's important to recognize that, the capitalist institution of American colleges is setting every single student up not to be like part of the vanguard, but to be pawns of imperialism and capitalism. The PAC students are often like under kind of an illusion that their major is like the better version of political science. But they're really being fed like postmodernist, anti-revolutionary ideas under the guise of being like radical. So unfortunately, this manifests in like ideas of horizontal leadership without addressing the leadership that arises undemocratically. So I think one of the things that we could do better in the future is really, from the beginning, institute a system of democratic centralism. Because a lot of people would preach like the importance of like an anarchistic approach, but would take on like unaccountable roles of power and not validate the concerns or criticisms that other people in supposedly the same level of leadership had, that were very valid. And I think that just generally we need to struggle against these ideas of anarchistic organization, because it leads to that unaccountable leadership. And when poor decisions are made, we need to learn how to rectify those and not make it so we're like trying to protect people's feelings over the sanctity or the continuance of like the encampment. And furthermore, it plays into ineffective communication. And that's another thing that I think we needed to establish very early on. It took a long time to set up an effective communication system, and we would push back important meetings due to programming. And in some cases, we've had meetings with like the leaders of the committees, pushed back, but leaders wouldn't communicate their updates or needs to the rest of their groups. So it would be like we would talk about what we need, but we wouldn't have a person delegated to actually fulfill that necessity. So in the future, I think it's important to set those dedicated times to talk to each other, to talk to the wider community, to talk to people within these committees, and to talk between committees. I think also, like, the third point is the importance of a strong ideological basis. I think it's important to acknowledge the importance of this. I think that it's important to understand our enemies and understand what we're fighting for, and not to shy away from the inherently political nature of what we're doing. We try to frame it for, like, to be palatable to other people, that this is like something beyond politics. But I think that we should recognize that, things are political, and just because something exists in the realm of politics doesn't mean it's bad. There is a correct position to take here, and it is the anti-colonial position. And I think we were just a little too concerned about our presentation. We were scared of looking a little too radical, which maybe allowed us to exist until day 17 without police. But it typically meant avoiding conversation or education surrounding the resistance in Palestine. I don't think we really ever talked about armed resistance. And I think that played into our reliance in negotiating with the administration, which after stopped talking with us, we were at an impasse, and we didn't have a clear direction of where to go. We needed to escalate appropriately. You have to ride a fine line of, like, what types of escalations are appropriate and when they're appropriate and what degree. You can start with small escalations, you can have one large escalation, but that's something that needed to happen, and we kind of just stayed still, I suppose. And then I think the last thing is a stronger defense plan. We pushed off defense planning in favor of other events, and this was particularly a mistake after admin stopped our negotiations. We needed better communication between the defense leaders, between the marshals, and the people doing the negotiations. And overall, just better leadership in defense. Yeah, I think those are my main takeaways.